last few moments remind me of something that one of you told me a few weeks ago. One of our people here at New Hope had invited somebody to watch our worship service online, and they were looking for a church, and they said, "Hey, you ought to try this out." So they watched it, and they came back and they said, "Hey, I thought it was pretty good, but my question is, why do you have a concert before the guy gets up to talk?" Which reminds us again, and if you're first time here at New Hope and this is new to you, if you're not a sort of a religious person, but you're here because somebody brought you today, or she's kind of cute or he's kind of cute, and that's why you're here, you may be asking the exact same question. It's great to sing, really. I mean, they did a great job today, and it's really about what it offers for us, the moment it gives us, to stop and forget all the stuff out there and just be present in this moment. And I hope today that you've experienced that presence just for a moment, maybe, that you've been able to put off whatever stuff you brought today. Because I know some of us, when we come each week, bring some stuff. And it's hard stuff, and it's tough stuff. And for some of you, it is everything within your being just to get up and get dressed and get here today, because this is where you need to be. And for some of us, it was the cap of a week, and it was just a great way to cap this all off. So again, that's why we have this whole concert before we start today. And I want to give a shout out to our dots all around the world. Actually, we had a new dot pop up in Norway this last week, so a shout out to Norway, and up in Montreal and Brazil and South Africa, and lots of all around the U.S., Oregon, California, Illinois, Indiana, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, D.C., Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and if I forgot anybody, sorry. But we're glad you've joined us today. And I'm glad that you've joined us in this space today as we wrap up this 6 months to Thanksgiving message. And we've been talking about this, and it really relates to something that all of us has experienced. We've either been on the receiving end of this ancient wisdom that's been passed down from generation to generation, and if you were on the receiving end of it, you may have even contributed to the passing on of this great, timeless wisdom. And it goes something like this. A child says to their parent, "That's not fair." To which the wisdom boils out from the depths of the parent, and they say that life and in that moment as a parent, you feel like you have just accomplished your role, right? You've just passed on this great wisdom that has been passed from generation to generation, and now you've delivered it to your child. And now they understand that life is not fair. But let's be honest, as good as we feel in that moment, we all wish life was fair. And there's another part that goes with the whole life isn't fair, and that is that life isn't even. Right? Because you know some people that got stuff better than you, they had a better start than you, came from a better family than you, have better hair than you. Why is somebody saying "ah"? Thank you. But this unevenness and this unfairness, and the reality is those things tend to squeeze us in, and that it turns something within us that this unfairness and this unevenness makes us search out, and at times get frustrated, and at times to get self-focused, and times to shut down, and this thing called ingratitude begins to bubble up. When it bubbles up, it begins to shrink our soul and begins to just make life not everything it could be, in all of its unfairness and of all of its unevenness. And this is not just a religious thing, this is just a people thing, right? That life isn't fair. And as much as you want to pass that wisdom along, you know there are moments for your daughter or for your son when those words will be no more true than the moment they're experiencing. And yet somehow you wish you could change that moment for him or for her. Because you wish in that moment life was just a little fairer. Or that life was just a little more even. which is why we've been spending a few weeks talking about this and why we talked the very first week that this is sort of our baseline, that life is just better when you start with thanks. That there's this choice. In fact, here's the part that we're going to focus on today, that you have more control than you think you do. For some of us, we think, oh, no, I can't change them. My circumstances, they're in direct, I can't change my job situation. I can't change my home situation. It is what it is, and so I just have to bend and grare it, but I don't want to do that. But all of us have more control than we think we do. And in fact, some words from this old letter that we're going to look at today, written by a guy named Paul, who, if you've been around, you know Paul seems to have written a lot of the New Testament, right? He wrote 2/3 of this part of our Bible called the New Testament. A lot of it are these letters he wrote to churches in different places. We're going to look at another one of those today. And it's just a small portion. It's actually the wrap-up, the conclusion to a letter that he writes. But in that, he will give us a peek into this great truth, that we get to control how we feel about things, how we look at things. Even though we say, no, I can't control my feelings, there are parts we can do. And how important that is, because if we can start with thanks, the hope is that maybe we can finish with thanks, as opposed to starting with ungratefulness or unthankfulness or just this frustration. And it's so hard when we're stuck in that to change out of that. Because let's be honest, most of us in this space, we don't drift in great directions, right? I mean, if life just goes on, we typically end up in places we wish we weren't. How many of you 6 months ago wished you had started fill in the blank? But you haven't yet, right? But you wish you had now because you think, oh, if I'd started 6 months ago, man, bathing suit season's coming up and I'd be there, right? It's now a little too late for bathing season, right? Unless you're going to the southern hemisphere, and then you got a shot. But it's always this, that just drifting. If life just goes on, we tend to end up in places wishing and regretting that we had made some choice and decision. So today, before we look at this great piece of wisdom that was passed along to this particular church, and I think has some great weight for us, I want to invite you to bow your heads and pray just after we look at some great advice on how much control we have. By the great theologian Howie Mandel, who some of you only know as a game show host. Before that, he was the really old people in the room said comedian, all right? He says, I'm from Canada, so Thanksgiving for me is just Thursday with more food. And I'm thankful for that. Got some control, right? He's Canadian. Thanksgiving doesn't mean anything to him, but some good food, and that's bad. Irma Bonbeck, another old comedian, she said, what we're really talking about is a wonderful day when no one diets. I mean, why else would they call it Thanksgiving, right? Today I don't got to worry about that. And to our last one is the renowned theologian. There's always something to be thankful for on Thanksgiving, even if it's just not being a turkey. We have more control than we think, and it's about how the choices we make and the decisions we make and how they can get us there. So before we get there, I invite you to bow your heads and let's pray one more time together, all right? Lord, the last few weeks we have talked about, we have thought about, for some of us we have tried this whole idea of being more thankful. And for some of us, we're reminded again of just how long this process may take because of how we've drifted, where we've ended up. But I believe you are a God that changes people's lives. But you never do that by force or coercion, but you honor our desires to have lives that are better, that are more hopeful, that are more thankful, that are more faithful. And so today I just ask that, again, as we look at some words that were written long, long ago, that somehow they can find a resting place. Somehow they can find a place that stick with us. And that maybe, just maybe, these words will be the thing that will start us on a change, on a process. That in 6 months will get us to the place that we wish we had been if we'd started 6 months ago. And if you can help us do that today, even just a little bit, we'll leave these places as people who are a little more thankful in your name. Amen. Hey, if you want to follow along, we're going to be over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians comes before 2 Thessalonians. Very good, right? No hard questions today, folks. And it's written to a church in, anybody know? Thessalonica. Very good, all right. So Paul has visited this church. He's writing to them. If you've read the book, he covers a lot of things. Just before what we're going to look at today, he's talked about death and the reality of death and how painful that is, but how as a follower of Jesus, somebody who believes in Jesus and the incredible story about somebody dying and coming back to life and all the stuff that goes with them, how in the midst of that terrible moment that you and I can have some peace, have some hope, that we can grieve. We ought to grieve in those moments. That we can grieve as people who have some hope that this is not the end for them. And after that, he will go on and talk about how we treat others, how we look at others, how we ought to encourage each other, how we ought to consider how our lives impact each other. And then he switches that whole gear from looking at everybody else, and he talks about ourselves and how we treat ourselves and the way we think and what we do with those things. And so he writes these words beginning in verse 16. Always be joyful. That is, rejoice. Pray continually without ceasing, and give thanks whatever happens. That is, in all circumstances, in everything, period. To which, if you're like me, you think, really, Paul? Be joyful in everything? I mean, is that even reasonable to write these words to people who had been thinking about death? Because apparently somebody important in that particular small congregation had passed away. Always be joyful. Paul, we're supposed to be joyful for that. And for some of you, even in this room or watching online, you're thinking to yourself, how is that possible? And knowing what my circumstance or my situation, how is that possible to be joyful? And the thing we have to keep in mind is Paul's beliefs that undergird his whole letter here. Because Paul is writing to somebody who is convinced that God is active and working for the good in the lives of those that are his followers, those who believe in him. In fact, he will write to another church that all things work together for the good of those that love God and that God is working in their lives. And one of the things I've learned after being a follower of Jesus for now the majority of my life is that the goodness that happens for all of us isn't equal and isn't always fair. That sometimes the goodness is uneven. Something good happens to you that's maybe not so good for me, but because it's all working out, that it all begins to work out. I'll give you an example. If the Dallas Cowboys and the Washington Redskins were playing in the NFC Championship game, and you had a lot on the stake on line on that, let's just say you have personal commitment into that. Because I know we have some Dallas Cowboy fans, right? I'm sorry for you. And we have some Washington Redskin fans, right? And I'm sorry for you as well. But if those two were playing, who should win? The Giants, yeah. I feel really sorry for you. But I mean, think about it, right? At the end of that night, somebody's going to be sad. And you say to yourself, how is that good for me? I mean, I was generous. I was a Redskin fan, which I'm not. We all clear on that? But I'm a Redskins fan, and I've graciously invited some Cowboy fans over for this evening. to share my home, to share my food, to share my big screen TV. And they won. And now my team is lost. They're done for the year. All my food's gone. And it was eaten by those lousy Cowboy fans, right? And you look at it, how is that good? And again, those are those moments that we have to recognize things can't be good 100% of the time for everybody in the way we consider goodness. But Paul recognized that, but he recognized that God is still active in those things. And that God can take even the saddest moments and bring some kind of good out of them. And what he hopes we understand as his followers is sometimes it isn't just about me. It's almost always about him and about others and about how God is working in their lives. And if things don't always go great for me, but they go good for somebody else, and that's going to be helpful to them in the big scheme of things, maybe that's not a bad thing. And that's what undergirds Paul as he writes these letters when he says, listen, always be joyful. And the word actually in the original language is this idea, rejoice. Rejoicing is a choice. I'm choosing to rejoice. When we were singing that last song, right? I'll stand. Some of you stood. That was a choice you made. Nobody forced everybody to stand, right? Nobody said everybody got to stand up in this moment. But in that moment, you chose to stand. Some of you chose to raise your hands because that's what we were singing about. I raised my hands, right? My arms lifted high. And that was choosing to respond to that moment, choosing to rejoice in that moment. And that's what he's talking about, that we have choices all during the day to rejoice. And rejoice is a choice we make up here. It isn't just, I'm feeling like being joyful today. It's about rejoicing and making that choice. Secondly, when he talks about pray continually. Have you ever read this line and thought, how is that possible? I mean, some of you commute. You don't want to be, I fold my hands, I close my eyes, and I prayed all the way to work. I don't want anybody doing that, all right? And that's not what Paul, as he talked about this, he's talking about something much bigger, much greater than that. This prayer continues, he's just talking about how we connect with God and how to be open to that thing. And so without ceasing, this is just about a communication. It's not about closing my eyes, folding my hands, and praying. And then when he says, and give thanks, whatever happens, he is again talking about a choice. These aren't commands he's given these people that he cares about. He's reminding them that we all have a choice in those moments of how we're going to relate to them, what we're going to choose in that moment, how we're going to respond to that moment. And even though I said it had a period, there's actually one more thing that goes along with it. This, or that is, all these three things, that is what God wants. That's God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So if you ever wonder what God's will for you, there you go. You ought to rejoice. You ought to always be praying. You ought to be giving thanks in spite of the things that happen. That's God's will for you. And this is the universal you. This isn't just you particularly as a person. This is for all of us. That's what God wants for us. That's what God desires for us. Which brings us to this slide. Because for a lot of us, our biggest battles are not with those around us. Isn't with our neighbor down the road that, every weekend has all of his buddies over and they sit out, play music, loud music, and they drink all day Saturday and Sunday, and when they leave, it's just a mess down there. That's not really our biggest problem. Your biggest problem isn't the guy in the 3 cubicles down that brings his ethnic food that he loves, but it just is not a good smell for an office environment. For most of us, if we recognize it, our biggest issues are about how we make the choices to follow Jesus. And sometimes it's about the big things about it. Following this is going to cost me that. But on a lot of levels, it's about the choices of how we're going to see life, the lens we're going to look through, the direction we're going to go, how being a follower of Jesus impacts how I feel about me, you, and them. And having to make a choice about how I think about me, you, and them. Here's the reality. The choice you make today opens up the choices you can make tomorrow. That literally is as good as it's going to get today, folks. So I'll read it one more time, slowly and with feeling, all right? The choice you make today opens up the choices you can make tomorrow. That's why I believe when Paul writes these words, he is talking about the choice to rejoice, the choice to pray continually, the choice to give thanks in spite of what happens in life. Because if I make that choice today, then tomorrow as I face some stuff, I'm already at a much better starting part than I was today. And that's why tomorrow, this choice today sets me up for tomorrow. But if I don't make that choice today, I'm limiting what I can have happen tomorrow. So let me kind of summarize this in some different language. Becoming and staying thankful. Paul would say, listen, begin with the end in mind. Do you know why it's so important to begin with the end in mind? Because if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to go if you get there, right? And we got to know where we're going, what we're hoping to accomplish. And if it really is to be more thankful in 6 months, then now's the day to start, right? But if I have it, that's my end goal, so I start today, then I can know when I get there in the direction I'm going. Because in reality, we are filled with a room filled with people with great intentions, right? You have great intentions. In fact, you may even have a list of intentions. Some call it a to-do list, a honey-do list. And you intend to get to those things. How's that going, by the way? It's when we begin to make those directions, when we begin with the end in mind. But the key word there is not end in mind. The key word there is the beginning part. Because that's always the hardest part, isn't it? I mean, you think about the things that you've been trying to accomplish. I need to go back to school to get this degree in order to take advancements in my career. 6 months from now, I need to go back to school, right? Anybody in that category? Yeah. I'm not going to ask about the diet one because that's a little touchy. But we all know, right? It's always the beginning that's the hardest. But once you begin, you notice that the next piece gets a little bit easier. Not dramatically easier, just a little bit easier. And the more you do it, the more easy it becomes. Until it finally becomes a habit, becomes part of who we are. And that's why beginning with the end in mind is so important. The second thing he talks about is simply this, to be open for business. The whole idea of praying continuously is simply about being open for business. Because some of us are in that waiting, we're not ready to open for business yet. We're getting this in place, getting that in place, getting this other thing in place. Paul would simply say, might as well open for business and figure it out as you go along. Because if we're not open for business, it means we're closed, right? Look around the room real quick. Look around the people next to you, around you. Anybody look closed to you? There's a few of us that are closed. But you know how frustrating it is to go to a store, grab the door, and it's locked? Or you call a business, and you get the news. But being open for business is simply this idea of praying continuously, that all I'm trying to do is work on my receptivity. All I'm trying to do is stay open so that if God wants to say anything, if he wants to do anything, I'm more aware than I was if I'm just going about daily business. And the last step is simply this, which is actually a pretty good life principle. If you find yourself in one of those places that, how can I do this? How honestly can I How can I rejoice in everything? And that's crazy talk. How can I pray continually, especially as I think about prayer? Or how can I give thanks in any and all circumstances? That doesn't seem reasonable. And I would simply say, if you find yourself in that category, in that spot, maybe you need to follow the instructions. Because I'm guessing all else has failed, right? It's not working, and so if it's not working, maybe you ought to give the instructions a try. Which I know for the guys in the room, this is like step 59 on a list of 10 steps. Right? Because you say to yourself, I can figure this out. And normally after a few days and a few trips to Home Depot or Lowe's, you go online. And you follow some instructions, which is interesting. We'll follow the instructions of some guy on YouTube who we've never met. But that thing called a manual, that's not just a Hispanic guy's first name. It's true. It's not just a Spanish guy's first name, right? That we don't want to open up, but the YouTube guy we'll watch, right? Who's following the exact same steps the manual's given us. Sometimes it's a good thing to follow the instructions. And part of that is being thankful, choosing to be thankful. And not because everything is perfect, but because God is. That's an easy thing to say. It's a harder thing to live out and believe, especially when your current situation doesn't seem something to be thankful for. But it's the belief that undergirds Paul as he writes these words. The reality is that that is God, is faithful. That he cares, even when. I want you to say those two words with me. Even when. Because we all have an even when, right? If you haven't had it yet, you are going to have it. If you've already have it, you know exactly what it is. If you're currently in it, you're going, it's right now. But all of us have an even when moment that you wonder, does he really care? Is he really faithful? And as Paul writes these words, I think he's driving to the core of that, saying, listen, you choose to be thankful. Not because everything is perfect at this moment. Because again, he was writing this letter to people who had experienced the death of somebody close to them. You're thankful because you still believe in God even when. Or in spite of. In spite of this, in spite of that. So I want to do something today. I want to follow along with Paul's three counsels: to choose joy, to be open, and to give thanks. How many of you would like to join me this morning in choosing joy? Stand up if you want to do it. You can stay seated. This is no pressure, right? Honestly, no pressure. Just stay. I don't want everybody. This is a choice, right? And if you were choosing joy, how would you respond? Thank you, Sandy. That's how Sandy would respond. Some of you need to remind your face that you've chosen joy, all right? It's kind of a good connection, right? Choosing joy, right? All right. Thank you. You can sit down now. You've chosen joy. You're set for the day. I take a moment just to choose joy today as well. I am so joyful and thankful to be part of this church. You don't know how much meaning and value it's added to my life. And I regularly have the privilege of talking to people all around the country, pastor friends I have, people I've met for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And this church has a wonderful reputation. And it has a reputation as a joyful place, which is a good thing. that you come and we're going to have a good time. And we're going to be happy about having a good time. And that's a reason to choose joy. To take what happens here on every Saturday, every Sabbath, and try to let it spread out and hopefully get you all the way to the next week. But to choose joy. To be open. How many of you would like to be open? All right, so here's what I want you to do to be open. Get real comfortable and just kind of flop out. If you got somebody close to you, yeah. If you don't know him or her yet, but you kind of like to know him or her, go ahead and just say, hey, I'm just following what the pastor said. Hey, being open, that's all good. We like to help relationships around here. Here's the crazy thing. People have studied this. They have figured out that body position impacts how you feel. Do you know that? You go, turn on TED Talks. They've got some great ones. They say if you put your hands up like this, stand up straight, like you've just had a big victory, right? And you keep them up for 60 seconds, that scientifically they've proven that you're going to be more confident at the end of that 60 seconds. It doesn't make sense, right? If you smile, put a big smile on your face right now and hold it for 10 seconds, even if you don't feel happy inside, at the end of 10 seconds, you're going to be a little happier than you were when you started. Maybe just simply because you cannot smile anymore. I don't know, but it's about being open to what's taking place. And lastly, to give thanks. And I want to give thanks to those of us that are gathered here today, those of you that have been attending less than 8 months. I'm just thankful that you've been here, that you've making this your church family, that you're coming, that you're getting a chance for us to get to know each other, and hopefully you're getting engaged. And for those of you that have been here for longer than 8 months, I want to thank a couple of groups specifically. For those of you that give regularly to support what goes on here, thank you. You'll hear later in community life that 100% of what you give in your local offering stays here, helps us do all the stuff we do. Everything that happens here outside of our 4 pastor salaries gets covered by your gifts. And I appreciate that. It is so good just to be able to have money to make decisions, to do the things that we need to do. We had a big storm come through on Thursday. Any of you live in Columbia? Columbia folks, right? You know about it. Tornado touchdown. And we were in the line of path. Actually, Dory and I were here at the office. It was about 3:40. The lights had gone off. They'd stayed off long enough that nothing was going to work. So we were standing watching out in the parking lot, and the wind was just blowing. Everything was going sideways, right? Watched it for a while, watching the trees all got really dark. She'd gotten one of those warnings on her phone that said, take shelter. My lousy phone didn't tell me anything. It just stayed there. She took shelter. Mine didn't tell me to do, so I stood at the door. A little bit later, the wind was going the other way, and the rain was going the other way, which I thought to myself, Mike, now it'd probably be a good time to go down the hallway, because it was going that way really hard, and now it's going this way. That's not good, right? So I went back. We came back out. We stayed for about a half hour. Electricity wasn't coming on. I said, might as well go home because can't print anything, can't do a bunch of stuff we were needing to do. So as I left, I went down Browns Bridge. There was a tree across the road, so I couldn't go that way. So I came back, went to the neighborhood right across the street over here. There were trees down, there were branches down, there were leaves all over the place. It looked like a natural disaster kind of zone. Our elevator got knocked out, so we had to get somebody out. This is where I'm going for this whole thing. Elevator got knocked out on Thursday night, so yesterday didn't work. So I could call somebody up and say, hey, I need you to come out and fix it. I came out and fixed it. So those of you who enjoy the elevator, you helped pay for that today, so thank you for that. And the other group I want to thank is those that have been here over 8 months who are actively involved in volunteering and serving in one of our ministries here. We could not and would not be the church we are without you. And if you're a volunteer, I just want to ask you to stand up. If you volunteer in any of our ministries here, stand up for a moment. It's more than just thank you. Yeah, get them all over there. The sad thing is there's a bunch of people in the other half of the building that didn't hear that, so if you see them, go tell them thank you today. Now you may be thinking, I've been here more than 8 months, I don't regularly give, and I don't serve in a ministry. What do you got for me? And my answer is, we don't have participation programs here, participation awards for those of you that aren't contributing. Seriously, we don't, right? I mean, I've discovered that if you give of your time, give of your life, give of your money, that something's going to happen in your life. And for those who've been here over eight months that haven't done those things, I feel sad for you. But there's not like an award today that says, hey, you're the best person, the best seat sitter that we have around here. Here's your little award, right? You have an okay smile, but we're glad because you have an award. We're not doing any of that kind of stuff. But again, thank you, especially for those of you that have been here a long time. How many of you have been here for over 15 years? Stand up for a moment. These are people, those of us who have been here less than 15 years, really owe a debt of gratitude and thanks to. They helped us start on this journey and helped us get to this place. And so I hope you take a moment just to thank them for having the vision to be able to create a space like this.